you get directed a lot, don't you think you'd be pretty upset about this case? Don't you think you might, cry a little bit? And then you have to think, well, I cried last week, and I might cry next week. If I cry every week, I'm not really a doctor. I'm kind of a crybaby, so. I didn't know it was going to be as vast as it became, but I knew when I read the pilot script that he had the farthest road to travel, because the pilot, in essence, is his first day on the job. So whereas every other character had to start off at a high level of proficiency and professionalism, my guy was going to have to get good eventually, and I figured that would be a good journey. I also didn't have high expectations for how long the show was going to go, and I thought it would kind of be an in and out situation, and I'd take the money from the pilot and run, which I was very wrong about. But in terms of the character's arc, yeah, it was one of the most rewarding things I think I'll ever have an opportunity to play as an actor, and one of the rarest occurrences in my experience on television where a character started off as basically comic relief. I was the guy that would spill trays of urine on myself and sort of fall down and pass out at the sight of blood, and then eventually became a drug addict and became committed to international relief medicine, and eventually comes back to the hospital, I think finishing up as chief resident. So from third year intern to chief resident, and from sort of comedic ancillary character to the center of the ensemble was quite a road. That was my audition scene, actually, that IV scene. And oddly enough, I was administering to a character actor named Troy Evans, who appears in our pilot and then came back years later to be Frank, the desk clerk. And we never made mention of the fact that he'd been my first patient. And yet it was that same character. Yeah, it was just one of those scenes that it was all in the writing. Michael Crichton wrote the pilot script for ER in 1975 after he finished his third-year rotation at Harvard Medical School. And it sat lingering on the shelf as a feature script for 20-some-odd years until they decided to turn it into a series. But that scene was one of the few that didn't really get changed at all from its original format. And I just knew that if I went in and I did this little bit where once I stuck him and the guy screamed, if I just looked around to make sure that I wouldn't get in trouble, that I'd have the room in the palm of my hand. And I did that. I had 2 auditions. I did that scene twice, and I got the job on it. I give a lot of credit to Rod Holcomb, who directed our pilot and the 100th episode and the series finale, for which he won a well-deserved Emmy for. He had a knack for taking basically what was a very technical, very jargon-based script and infusing it with a lot of humanity and creating relationships between looks and behavior that really fleshed out the storytelling. And probably the clearest example of that is Juliana Margulies' character was supposed to die in the pilot. She was supposed to overdose, which left basically 2.5 scenes where she was a conscious, walking, talking human being. But as she lay on her deathbed, the looks and the energy that everybody else conveyed about their feeling towards her was so powerful that when they tested the pilot, her character tested way through the roof, way higher than it would have just based on the scenes that she had to play. And so I think Rod is instrumentally responsible for her character lasting the run of the show like it did. It was daunting. I mean, I used to say it's like learning Latin, and someone said, no, it is Latin. Oh, right. Well, that would explain why it sounds so Latinese. Yeah, the jargon was difficult to get down in the beginning. And although those long uninterrupted takes were actually as difficult as they can be to pull off technically, they're harder on the crew than they are on the actors. If the actors have any kind of theater training, it's the most free that you have to explore space when you're working with the camera, because you're not locked onto a mark and you're not keyed into one particular light. You have the run of the hospital, and the camera's responsibility is to follow you. So from my perspective, I loved shooting those scenes because, you get to be a fully three-dimensional, physicalized character in those scenes. The crew, especially the cameramen, have to backpedal through 14 different rooms and have the choreography of gurneys and wheelchairs and all sorts of stuff going But there was a learning curve to it. I know you spoke to Eric LaSalle. I don't know if he told you about the 22.
He did, but you tell me this story.
This gesture became kind of a touchstone gesture because I think it was Eric's first day on the show. He was the last character cast. Everybody had been assembled except they couldn't find Dr. Benton. And it was a sort of a midnight session on a Friday night where they finally pulled the trigger on his offer and he started work on Monday. And the very first day of work, he had to deliver what we used to call a bullet, which is a huge, long monologue of medicalese as he gives my character a tour through the hospital. And, you know, he was nervous, and it was his first day, and he was prepared, but things happen. And, you know, one take led to the next take, led to the next take, and finally we got up to about 19 or 20 takes, and I see the director and the cameraman started getting really nervous because we were running out of film, and we were shooting at Linda Vista Hospital in East LA, and we probably wouldn't be able to get another shipment in that day. So that we were on the last magazine of film, on basically the last take that we could shoot that day, and he finally got the monologue down, and it was the 22nd take. And so the rest of us, being fairly competitive but good-spirited, you know, we used to tease him about it taking 22 takes. And then the very next week, I got given a very long monologue, and I was so intent not to screw it up that I memorized it and so thoroughly that I have total recall of it and can perform it for you now, 16 years later.
65-year-old male, doesn't it? Go ahead.
It does. 65-year-old male with severe peripheral vascular disease manifested by claudication of the left calf. 10 days post-op for Mercy General after having an aortobifemoral bypass. Normal post-operative course till about 6 hours ago when he began to experience the gradual onset of lower left quadrant pain without palliative or provoking factors. BP 120/80, pulse 112, respiration 78. Upon auscultation, diminished breath sounds were noted at the base of the patient's right lung. Intrigued, I tested vocal fremitus probate second edition, leading me to a diagnosis of pleural effusion confirmed by this radiograph, which shows fluid in the patient's right costophrenic sulcus. Take that. She gave me a lot of criticism. I don't know about tips, but the phone would ring at about 11:02 on Thursday night, and I'd hear, "You never touch your face with bloody gloves," or, you know, "You never button your lab coat up that high," or, you know, whatever choice piece of thing that I'd done wrong that she would be held accountable for when she went back to her hospital the next day. If it wasn't right, she'd catch flack for it. So she was sort of one step removed technical advisor. That was the point. I mean, if there's anything that we, the original ensemble in particular, feel proud of, it's that we hit the ground running, felt very strongly about earning credibility within the medical community, first and foremost. We wanted these guys to feel and look and sound like real emergency room physicians. So we spent a lot of time shadowing guys around their hospitals, reading a lot of books, reading a lot of diaries being kept by medical students, asking a lot of questions, taking various procedures and equipment home so we could practice on our own so we could look more proficient the next day. We all had a very similar and strong work ethic when it came to the medicine, and really wanted that to be the point of the show. And the only dramatic license that we were taking was in condensing the amount of time it took to do the various procedures. We could intubate somebody 20 seconds where it may take 3 minutes, or we could crack a chest in, a minute where it might take 5. But everything we were doing was technically accurate, and we took a lot of pride in that. And the compliments we got from the medical community for our accuracy, we felt really differentiated us from other medical shows that were on TV at the time and had come before us. Well, I mean, ER was sort of novel for 2 reasons. One was the introduction of these long Steadicam oneers, as we called them, and the other was this fragmented sort of storytelling that moved away from your classic A storyline, B storyline, C comic runner storyline, which had been sort of traditional TV format up until that point. We would drop in on a storyline in the middle, or we'd just show the end, or we'd only show the beginning. And the idea was that the emergency room is such a place of transition. People are coming in and they're getting shipped off to another department. It's just it's a way station, for lack of a better term. And so the storytelling that we thought would be novel would be able to, to see the end, to see the middle, to see the beginning, and never really know what happened to these people necessarily, and have those storylines be effective insofar as they reflected something about our own personal character's storyline. which was sort of novel for the time. But yes, to answer your question, it became the actor's responsibility to be the keeper of his own flame, so to speak, in terms of character continuity, because the storylines were fragmented and we had so many different directors coming through. And at that time, the show was so popular that each person that came up to bat, was swinging for an Emmy fence. And, the Emmy fence usually includes making your character cry a lot. So you get directed a lot, don't you think you'd be pretty upset about this case? Don't you think you might, cry a little bit? And then you have to think, well, I cried last week, and I might cry next week. If I cry every week, I'm not really a doctor. I'm kind of a crybaby. So I have to sort of pick and choose my moments here. I remember Michael Crichton watched some of the early footage, and one of the comments he made, I think it was about a scene I played, where a patient was brought in, and I looked at the patient's face, and his comment was, treat the wound, not the patient. And we all went, right. When a patient comes in, we don't care what they look like. We don't care what their name is. All we care about, what's the problem? And so that changed a lot for us. We suddenly thought, it's okay to be unsentimental about our work, as long as the stakes that we're employing are life and death, and we take our job very seriously. It doesn't matter that we're not doing the touchy-feely doctor thing that you've seen time and time again. It also allowed us an opportunity to pick and choose those moments when a character was really affected by a patient and have that really be punched up a bit. My character had an affinity for children and old people in particular, kids with leukemia. Touched on his character's backstory. He had lost a brother to leukemia. So when moments like that and characters like that popped up, you thought, okay, now I can take my time and play a little bit more sentimentality. But we used to do this thing. They used to screen the episodes for us at lunch on Wednesdays as a group, and we'd watch them in John Wells's office. And I don't know what the rest of them say about that experience, but from my mind, we were pretty merciless on each other. We had rules that needed to be followed. You were always supposed to be working. You could not take a moment to yourself. If any character, any actor, took a moment to themselves and sort of sighed or rubbed their neck or took a little kind of character moment, we would be merciless. We would fire on that person and tease them mercilessly and yell at them and say how unacceptable that was, because we wanted it to seem like no matter what, there's another patient to treat. No matter what, you're needed someplace else. You're juggling 6 or 7 things all the time, so you don't have the time to take that personal moment. And if you do, it has to be earned by 3 or 4 episodes worth of a ramp up so that it really does become a moment of punctuation. And I think that helped. It helped keep up our level of pace, which was also novel for the time, but also just allowed you to sort of parse out the moments of sentimentality so it didn't get too cloying and stayed sharp. From the head, I'm sure you know, that came from the boss.
Right, Spielberg, yeah.
ER, the story is pretty famous now about Michael Crichton wanted to make the show. Steven didn't necessarily want to make the show. Steven wanted Michael to write Jurassic Park 2. Michael didn't want to write Jurassic Park 2. So there was a sort of quid pro quo deal struck. And then we made the pilot, and it was dark, and it was fast, and it was technically full of jargon. And the story was that they screened it, and Don Ohlmeyer, who was at the time at NBC, didn't like it. Didn't like it and said, I'm going to bury it. And the projectionist of the theater that they did the screening in said, you should test this with an audience. So they pulled the Tonight Show audience out of the Tonight Show and screened it for them, and it tested higher than any NBC pilot that year. And then Don Ohlmeyer said, I don't believe it. I don't believe it. I want to test it again. So they pulled the second Tonight Show audience out, and it went even higher. And that's pretty much how we got on the air, was because of those 2 random tests. Otherwise, we were going to be kind of buried. So we weren't really a darling in the beginning, and I don't think Mr. Spielberg knew quite what we had or if he wanted to put his name on it. And so I don't believe it had his name on the pilot or the first couple episodes. And then once we were up and running and the show was a bona fide success, he became very involved. And one of the things that he told the writers was that he had interned at an emergency room when he was in high school, and he had been moved by this memory of a dog being brought in and all the doctors taking time into their busy day to do mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on this dog and saving this dog's life. And so the very next week, a German Shepherd is brought into County General, and I had the dubious distinction of getting to suck on his nose for 4 or 5 hours. Oh, God, so many. I mean, the relationships alone, both on screen and off, I mean, we really became a family. We worked so many hours, especially in those first 5, 6 years, that we spent more time with each other than our own families. You know, we got very, very close. We saw each other through marriages and divorces and births and a few deaths, and that is probably the most rewarding aspect of it. But creatively, I got to work with some tremendous people. My character in particular got the best guest stars, I felt, because he had this affinity for old people. I got Eli Wallach, I got Red Buttons, I got Sanford Meisner, I got, oh God, there's so many. Alan Alda. So I got to, Mickey Rooney. I got to work with some amazing people towards the end of their lives and careers, which was Rosemary Clooney, just to name a few. Yeah, well, I mean, I'm sure it's a particular relationship that both Eric and I are very, very proud of, because that I don't believe had ever been shown on TV before, where the dynamic between a white character and a black character, the power dynamic was completely reversed, where he was in the power position and the Caucasian was in the subservient position. And I was the one that came from money, and he was the one that didn't. And I was seeking his approval and approbation, and he was giving me tough love. And so it was a relationship that was sort of drill instructor private, sort of mentor student, and traveled a long road to eventually get to this place of friendship and mutual respect. But, you know, it was sort of art imitating life, because I don't know if Eric told the story, but when we first met each other on the pilot, I went up to him and I said, "Hi, Noah Wyle, I'm a big admirer of your work." And he said, "Mm-hmm." And I said, "LaSalle, that's a beautiful name. Where does that come from?" And he said, "It's a slave name." And I said, "Right, okay. This is going to be awkward." Then we shot the pilot, and Eric and I didn't really know each other that well. And then I get this phone call in my apartment one night. I pick it up, and it's Eric. He says, "Hey." And I said, "Yeah." And he says, "What are you doing this summer?" Because we had 2 or 3 months to wait to see if the show was going to get picked up. I said, "I don't know. What are you doing?" He said, "I'm thinking about going to Spain. Do you want to go?" And I said, "With you?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, let me think about that, and I'll call you back." And I call George Clooney up, and I say, "Eric just invited me to go to Spain." He goes, "Don't go, don't go. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to go, you're going to fight, you're going to hate each other, have to come back and work together every day for the next 5 years. Don't go." I said, "You want to come with us?" He goes, "Yeah." So the 3 of us took off and went to Europe and just bummed around for 6 weeks. And we became such good friends on that trip that we came back and had a real shorthand and a real rapport with each other, Eric and I in particular. And so those scenes, right from the jump, you know, we were on the same page and in sync, because we'd sort of been rehearsing that relationship all summer long before we started shooting. In our case, it just, you know, we pretty much stayed on book. We stayed on script. We didn't do a lot of improvising with each other, but we do a lot of physical improvisation with each other. So if we'd be in a scene and I knew, you know, that if I dropped something, that I could count on him to stay in character and be annoyed that I dropped it, and that we could play all these silent beats with each other, and not get thrown by the choices the other person was making, but to understand the rhythm, and just sort of, it's a tennis match, you know, and the trust comes from, if I try something here, are you going to be thrown by it, or are you going to just sort of go with it and trust that I'm trying something out? And Eric, to his credit, was always game to play. That was memorable for several reasons. The woman was Glenn Headley, and she neglected to tell the producers that she was 4 months pregnant when she got the job. So we had to hide her pregnancy by having gurneys and things roll through under her chin, or have her hold up x-rays, you know, blocking her belly. But this particular scene, I had to sort of straddle her on the couch and which was really uncomfortable. And Eric came in, and we used to, we'd tease each other a lot and say, see if you could pull off 2 double takes. And he'd go, well, I can do that. I go, well, see if you can do 3. And then we'd make these bizarre bets when we get bored. I'm sure he told you the cheese story. Did he tell you the cheese story?
That one I did not hear.
Eric, this is totally off topic, but he was interested in becoming a director and wanted to make a short film, and he was looking for financing for his short film. So he asked me for money, and I didn't have a lot at the time, but craft service, the catering on the ER in the early days was pretty bare bones. And they would put out these big, gigantic blocks of sort of government cheese, cheddar cheese. And I said to him one night, late, I'll bet you $2,000 you can't eat all that cheese. And he says, how long do I have to eat it? I said, 30 minutes. And he said, can I have a cracker with it? I said, you can have as many crackers as you want. And that grown man proceeded to eat that cheese. All 7 pounds of it, or however much there was. And and I paid him, but to this day, I mean, the most memorable moment is I followed him out to his trailer and I heard him call his girlfriend and say, oh, baby, I think I did something stupid. And then there's a pause. He goes, I need you to go to the store. I need you to get some prune juice and a papaya. But yeah, I gave him the check, and I gave him one of those Wisconsin cheddar cheese hats to go with it. And I got a very nice credit at the end of his first short film. Thank you to Noah 2Gs Wiley. Well, there really were 2 leaders on the ensemble. Anthony Edwards was very much the lead actor on the show and the public face of the ensemble. And he was a very good leader. He had a nice career before ER and set a very high level of professionalism. But he hadn't worked a lot in TV. George had worked a lot in TV. George had this bizarre distinction of having made a tremendous amount of pilots that hadn't been picked up. And so he knew a good shot when he saw it, knew what made a show fall apart, knew what could make a show work. And very early on, I remember called us all into his trailer. And he said, okay, guys, this is the deal. This is the show where we're going to do it differently. Everybody's going to be nice to everybody. Everybody's going to know their lines, and we're going to show up on time. And there's not going to be a division between foreground and background or cast and crew. We're in this together. And we were all young enough and inexperienced enough that we kind of looked around, okay, sounds good to us. But it was a really poignant moment because it set the tone for what was going to be tolerated and what wouldn't be tolerated. So in the 15 years of the show's run, nobody ever threw a temper tantrum that I saw. Nobody ever locked themselves in a trailer. Any fight that happened on set was always creative and was always solved, professionally. It made a big difference. So in a lot of ways, I credit George and Tony for setting the bar for professionalism, but also giving us 2 really good leadership figures to sort of follow and help navigate through uncharted waters. George is an extremely smart guy, very political guy, and a very talented guy. And, he, I think, did the best work of his career up until that point on ER. And it was no surprise to anybody that he got tapped for bigger and better things early on. I give him a tremendous amount of credit for staying for the full 5 years that he was contracted to do, because he could have left a lot earlier. He was already making Batman, big movies, while he was still under contract with us. And this doesn't really have anything to do with the show per se, but like there was an instance where TV Guide had promised Eric LaSalle a cover. A lot of us had been on the cover of TV Guide, and they promised Eric a cover, and they kept pulling the cover back for some reason. They weren't running it. And then they decided that they were going to drop it altogether. And Eric wanted to complain publicly because he felt that he was getting short shrift, and he was. And George came to him and said, you can't fight this fight. And he said, well, why not? And he said, because it just won't look right. If you are crying for something that you're not getting, it looks like an actor whining because he doesn't get his due. We'll fight the fight for you. It looks better if we spearhead it. So he created this campaign, and he wrote a hell of a letter to the editors of TV Guide, and he went back into the archives and found that they had put more cartoon characters on their covers than African Americans, and that the only time they ever put African Americans on the cover was for the February month, which is the shortest month and Black History Month, and caused enough of a stink that Eric got his cover, and we all learned the power of George's pen. He writes a very good letter. Well, that's a tricky one because there's a lot of people that are in a position where, because they have a platform, there's an expectation that they're going to do something with it. I don't necessarily feel that those go hand in hand. I don't think actors, by and large, by definition, are spokesmen. That being said, a medical show, you're just going to be besieged by medical charities. It helps small organizations and large organizations a lot to have a celebrity presence and profile in their campaigns. So the ask was always there, and we were all fairly philanthropically minded and charitable people to begin with. So it really became more of picking and choosing the ones that had some resonance with us personally. I became a very strong advocate for different groups working with human rights. I joined the board of a legal-based organization called Human Rights Watch, which was fairly instrumental in deposing Pinochet and Charles Taylor in Liberia and people who were human rights violators. And then I did a lot of work with a medical relief organization based in New York that doesn't exist anymore, but it was the American version of Doctors Without Borders. And I got very interested in international triage medicine and volunteerism. And then I pitched the storyline to John Wells that it'd be a perfect fit for our show to have one of our characters go off and do this type of work. And so that was a nice synthesis for me, being able to weave in a particular cause that I felt strongly about into the show's narrative. And it was in perfect keeping with my character's trajectory, who in a lot of ways I was looked at as being sort of Henry IV, part one. He's going to be king one day, but before he's king, he'd rather hang out with the vagabonds and the thieves. And if he can prove himself and be seen as legitimate in their eyes, then he'll accept what his inheritance is. And I always felt John Carter had this guilt about the world he'd been born into. Before he could ever embrace it, he wanted to earn the respect of people who he felt were really on the front lines of life. And so that meant putting himself continually more and more in harm's way to prove that to himself. And the culmination of that was to be in Africa, in the Belgian Congo, and in Darfur. And then coming back from that, he sort of was able to sort of look life squarely in the eye and not apologize for it any longer. I remember in the first season, George, Tony, and I went across the street from the Warner Brothers lot to the Smokehouse restaurant to have lunch one day. And Tony brought his then infant son, Bailey, to lunch. And we were all in costume, wearing our lab coats and having our lunch. And Bailey ate a French fry and started to choke on it. And the three of us began to panic. And a busboy ended up coming around and clearing the boy's throat. And we laughed afterwards at how silly that must have looked for three guys that looked like doctors to be totally losing their cool and having the busboy come in and save the day. It's happened. It's happened, unfortunately, several times to me, where I've been on an airplane and a PA announcement will say, "Ladies and gentlemen, there's a passenger in the back of the plane who's experiencing chest pains. Is there anyone on the flight with any medical training?" And every head will turn to me, and I'll sit there and think, please let there be a doctor on this plane. Please let there be somebody else. And thankfully, there usually is. There were moments where life imitated art. I joke now that when we shot some of the episodes in Africa, we were shooting in the Kalahari Desert. It was 123 degrees. And the first IV that I ever administered to a human being was to revive the medic, who was the first person that passed out. So I stuck him with a 14-gauge needle and revived him with a bag of saline, and then I did 3 or 4 more that day. And, there was enough that we picked up through osmosis that we could actually practically be of use in certain circumstances. But those long, especially in the trauma rooms, which we used to refer to as the black holes of the set, because that's where directors would go to die. It took forever to shoot those trauma scenes, 6-7 hours for trauma scene. But you do basically what, I keep making this gesture because this is what the camera would do. It would go round and around the table and without stopping. And so the scenes, the medical scenes, had to be very extensively rehearsed beforehand because you weren't going to do it piecemeal. So the very first thing that would happen is you'd be called to the set to do a technical rehearsal. The technical advisor, who was usually a board-certified emergency room physician, would have blocked out the scene almost like a football diagram. You would have the gurney and the patient on the gurney, and then your positions around the gurney, and then the various procedures that were going to be employed, and the equipment that you would need to do those procedures, and who was going to pass that through, and what nurse was going to grab it out of which shelf. And so it became this ballet that you would rehearse over and over and over and over and over again, and before the camera even came in to see the scene, or the director even came to see it. And then you'd bring the crew in and you'd perform it for them, and then they'd figure out the angles that they wanted to photograph it from. But you rehearsed it very much like a play, so that you could do it from start to finish pretty much without stopping. And you had to be very slick. There was a lot of sleight of hand. You know, when you do an intubation, you have an ET tube that's about 13 inches long, and you have to put it down someone's throat, which obviously you can't really do. But you can mime it by putting it down the side of a patient's cheek if the camera's on the far side. And then underneath your watch band, you would have a little short ET tube. So as soon as the camera moved off of you, you'd take the long one and ditch it and put the short one in, and then make snappy fingers, which told the cameraman that you could come back and show it again. So without cutting, you could show the tube going in, then would go down to a hand, and then come back, and suddenly taping a short tube in. You could never tell the difference. And there were like 100 of those little tricks that we figured out over the years to make it look really slick. I'm on a TV show now, and there's a character who plays a doctor, and she benefits greatly from my cheat sheet of, you know, when you're doing CPR, you have to keep your elbows locked, otherwise it looks fake, but you won't be able to press very hard because it'll hurt the patient. So what you do is you slap the gurney with your thigh as you're doing the compressions, which makes the whole bed shake and makes it look like you're really wailing away on the body. I didn't take very many. I took a few souvenirs off the set. I took one of the doors, one of the ER doors that say County General, and I took an exit light, and I took my lab coat, and I asked for 2 1-by-1 foot squares of the trauma room floors because they were so distinctive, the kind of checkerboard pattern that was on the floors. I have both of those. But I took the CPR practice dummy that we'd all learned how to do all the procedures on for 15 years. We named him Bruce. And by the time we were finished, he had 2 fingers on this hand and 1 finger on this hand, and was stained with blood, and a hole in his throat from all the tracheotomies we'd done on him. And I mean, he's pretty well thrashed. Now he's wearing a tuxedo and sitting in my billiard room. We were working amazing amount of hours, and he was one of the leads of the show where I had a little bit more time off camera to learn my lines. He was working a lot. And so he developed a technique where he'd write the lines on the patient's bed sheet, so he could just sort of look down and read. Or he'd write his lines inside the medical clipboard, so he could say, well, it looks like you're going to need a CBC, Chem 7, cross-table, C-spine, cross-table, you know, and we're going to get that for you as soon as we can. Well, that was a question we were all asked time and time again. Medical shows in particular have always been popular, I think, because while most people don't have an opportunity to visit the inside of a White House or a police station or a courtroom, everybody ends up coming in the world in a hospital and going out in a hospital for the most part. And so there's an innate sense of curiosity about what's going to happen and who works there and how tired are they and how much do they get paid and what's going on in their personal lives that could be a factor in the way that they perform their duties. And I think that had a big part to do with our popularity. We came on the air right at the moment that Bill Clinton had been inaugurated president and had mandated health care reform as being his first order of business, and had appointed Hillary Clinton to lead the charge. So 7 episodes into the very first season, we were on the cover of Newsweek magazine with a headline that said, a healthcare program that really works. So it was in the zeitgeist. Everybody was talking about healthcare reform. And then it just got bigger. There were a lot of ER closures in the 90s as places lost their funding. And those closures forced populations to go to other hospitals, which overwhelmed these other hospitals. A lot of people were going without health insurance, which meant that they were using emergency rooms as their primary care physician. that they would wait and go to the doctor only when something really was wrong with them. So emergency rooms were sort of, we were joking, like they're the front lines of American medicine, and then to a certain extent our program became the very first line of defense, and then a real emergency room, and then a general practitioner. Aside from that, really good writing, you know, some actors that were very committed to their roles, whose relationships off screen kind of transcended and came across on screen, and a really slick style. We had a lot going for us. We had an all-star team of writers, especially in that first season. John Wells, Lydia Woodward, Robert Nathan, Waylon Green, Lance Gentile, Paul Manning. They were, I mean, tremendous writers. And the kind of writers, when you read a Paul Manning script, you went, I know who wrote that. Paul Manning wrote that. Nobody could have a black sense of humor like that. Where you read a Robert Nathan script, you just felt it. Over the years, scripts became a little less distinguishable from each other, but in the beginning, each writer had such a strong voice that it really kind of came through in spades. I've got nothing but gratitude, nothing but gratitude. I mean, it's a show that has given me some of the most rewarding friendships that I have, and it afforded me the rarest opportunity in an actor's life, which is to have some financial security, to be able to pick and choose jobs based on something other than the paycheck. And I've got this really interesting little niche in television history of being part of this really groundbreaking show. And I got to play a character who I never felt pigeonholed by, because he constantly changed and evolved. So it was, if I'd stayed being the comic relief character who was constantly screwing up, that may have been frustrating. But he kept growing as I kept growing. And so it wasn't a character that I felt prevented me from getting other work or being seen in another role. And I was especially gratified when they made that movie, John Carter, Warlord of Mars. How many articles said, no, there is a John Carter already, and it's not this guy.